Welcome to the Agent of Wealth podcast with Marc Bautis from Bautis Financial. In this podcast, Marc helps guide you towards financial freedom, ensure you never run out of money, and create a balance in life that prioritizes what is most important to you. Join us for this journey as Marc draws from years of expertise and guest experts to solve the multiple wealth building challenges involved in your financial life.
Welcome back to the Agent of Wealth. This is your host, Marc Bautis. Today I'm joined by a special guest, Matthew Fornaro, Esquire. Matthew is a business law attorney and the founder of Matthew Fornaro, PA, a law firm serving South Florida. Before starting the firm in 2003, he was an attorney at two prestigious AmLaw 200 law firms focusing on civil litigation. As a member of the Florida Bar and District of Columbia Bar, Matthew's expertise spans business transactions, business formation, business dissolution, business litigation, real estate transactions, intellectual property, and more. Matthew is also involved in mentoring new attorneys as both a graduate and instructor of the Kauffman Foundation's Fast Track New Venture Program, presented by the Broward County Office of Economic and Small Business Development and the City of Hollywood. He's also a graduate and instructor for the Florida State University College of Business. Matthew, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Marc. I'm glad to be here.
All right, so let's start off with a little bit of your background. I know as an attorney, you can go in a lot of different directions. What inspired you to become a business law attorney? Sure.
So I always knew that I wanted to be some kind of an attorney since like elementary school. So went to undergrad, took political science as my major to set up for law school. Went to law school, came out. I worked for a boutique firm in Boca Raton, and then I worked for two large AmLaw 200 law firms doing litigation. And most of the litigation I was doing was helping banks and big Fortune 500 companies. So with that paradigm, at the same time, I grew up with my dad owning his own small business and running his own small business. And now he's retired. He did pretty well for himself. But with that paradigm, I always saw him doing stuff and having issues that he was facing from a legal standpoint, even though he was running everything perfectly and everything went well, that I thought was underserved. So I had the opportunity about 9 years ago to go out on my own. And I decided I wanted to take my knowledge of helping big companies and big business and apply that to helping small, medium-sized businesses and startups. And that's kind of how I got into this space.
Okay, let's start with that startup company or that small business who's starting up. They're probably looking forward to making their first sale or whatever their specialty is. What are some of the legal issues that they need to consider, or some of the misconceptions that they have about legal issues and what they should be thinking about as a startup?
Sure. So the first thing they need to do is, before they take step one, is that they need to have a written business plan. So before they start up, before they get seed money, before they bring in people, before they do whatever, they have to have a clear written business plan that has the purpose of their business, the goals of their business, how they're going to get money, what they're going to do, how they're going to do it, what kind of business organization it's going to be, what their 1 year plan is, their 5 year plan, their 10-year plan. They have to have that all in place before they actually start doing stuff. Otherwise, it's not going to be very successful. And you need a business plan in place in order to do things like get a bank account later on, deal with legal issues, deal with your accountant, and deal with your attorney. So that's the first thing. Second thing is you got to pick your business organization and register in whatever state you're in or whatever state you choose, and then make sure you have your business organization governing documents in place at the same time. And you just don't click online and get a quickie business started. You actually have to make sure you have like articles of incorporation, corporate bylaws for like a corporation, or an operating agreement for an LLC, or a partnership agreement for a partnership. So once all that preliminary stuff is done, all that backstage kind of stuff is done, then we can get to let's start up your business and do stuff. So then you have to work with professionals and not do it yourself. Part of your business plan should be, if you want to have a successful business, you need to budget the time and resources to have an accountant, to have a banker, and hopefully to have a business law attorney help you along. And then you consult them and go over things with them as things progress, and they will help you in your business startup. And then obviously, then we can go work on, your product, your service, whatever it is you're going to do. But there's a lot of due diligence and a lot of setup that goes into getting to that point.
And as an attorney, do you come in right from the start? Because I know when you think of it, a lot of entrepreneurs are probably thinking, okay, let me talk to my accountant about this. But you mentioned the team should really be an accountant, a business law attorney, banker. Does each of those just come in from the beginning and say, okay, the entrepreneur has an idea, let's get this team together and figure out how to progress and do some of those backstage stuff that you talked about?
Yes, ideally you want that team in place right at the beginning. You don't want to assemble it as you go on after you've made some critical decisions and done some things. If you can do it before you get started in business, that's the best thing you can possibly do, is have your cadre of professionals you're going to rely on, have them set up before you start doing anything. Because if you start doing something now, instead of me proactively doing stuff, even if you do things correctly or whatever, I'm going to have to go back and fix some of the things you did, even if you think you did them correctly, and you've already started off on the wrong foot by doing that. So my advice, my hope, my goal is to have people on board before they start their business.
So then even let's take it one step further. So let's say they do all that preliminary things and they get the business formed and structured properly, and then they start operating the business. Where are some of the areas where they can run into problems, and what should they be thinking about to probably try and minimize actually encountering those problems?
Yeah, the main problem, you're going to have a lot of issues regarding employees, regarding taxes, regarding if you're like a brick and mortar, or if you have a physical space, regarding commercial leasing, things of that nature. So those are all issues that aren't necessarily problems, but they're things that you have to deal with as you go along. So you want to make sure that if you're a startup or a new business and you're going to have employees, you got to make sure that you go over with your attorney and your accountant how you're going to classify them. Are they going to be regular employees? Are they going to be 1099 contractors? Are they going to be per diem? What are they going to be? Same thing with if you're going to rent commercial space or rent a warehouse or whatever. You got to go over and make sure your lease is in order, make sure all the financials are in order, make sure all that's in order. The same thing regarding taxes. You want to make sure with your accountant and your attorney that you are the right business organization for your economic circumstances. You could be perfect for an LLC, but you could be a disaster for a corporation, or vice versa, depending on what your own personal economic background or status is, or your partner's status. So those are common startup issues that businesses face right off the bat once they're formed and once they get up and running.
And I guess every business is probably different, and what every business has to deal with is probably different. As an attorney kind of consulting on this, do you talk to the entrepreneur and then figure out, okay, we need to take care of this area, not this area? And like you mentioned, employees, that can really run a wide range of things that need to be dealt with. How do you kind of grow into what the entrepreneur is going to have to deal with? Is it kind of just as things come up, or is there some kind of, planning consultant that goes into it to kind of project out what they're going to need to set in place now versus what they're going to need to have in place as they're growing?
Well, proactively, every business is going to deal with some of the same issues. So we can deal with some of those same issues to begin with, and that's some of the stuff I just talked about earlier on. For subjective or specific businesses that have specific needs or whatever, we'll look to see proactively what we can do ahead of time in order to address those potential issues and address those things as best as we can. And then hopefully issues that arise as we go on will be fewer because we've done as much proactive work as we can. And then we'll address those issues as they pop up during the course of the business.
What kind of, issues could an entrepreneur get involved in terms of regulations? And I know some are state specific, but I'm sure there's some that are general. And how do they prepare for dealing with some of those? Yeah,
obviously, every state has totally different laws regarding regulation of employees, regulation of real property regulation, things like that. Federal regulation obviously is a huge issue, and depending on which space you're in or what business you're in or what market you're in, obviously there's levels of governance and levels of scrutiny that you're going to come under. So, it's a kind of not one size fits all. It depends on what industry you're in as far as how you're going to get regulated and who's going to regulate you, whether it's city, county, state, federal. And it's basically on a case by case basis. But everyone obviously falls under IRS, which is why you need to work with your accountant. Everyone falls under Department of Labor, which is why you need to make sure you have your employee situation sorted out. Objectively speaking, those will probably be two of the biggest issues that every business is going to face going forward. Employment regulation, if you have employees, and tax regulation based on you making revenue, paying taxes, and things like that. And then obviously, depending on which space you're in, you're going to have heavy regulation. If you're in like the cannabis industry, you're going to have a crazy amount of regulation at the state, particularly at the state level. If you're in blockchain or something like that and you're using financial information, you're going to have heavy regulation from the federal level regarding personal finances and things of that nature. So there's things that everyone's going to deal with, and then there's things that are very specific to the industry that your business is in that you need to obviously consult with someone to make sure that you're on, you're going to be on their radar and make sure that you prepare for and deal with things as best you can.
Kind of what you're mentioning, it can get complicated between different states, right? So, and now you're seeing more people work remotely, or companies doing more business remote. But how does that factor in to like some of these laws that they have to abide by? And then also from you being a consulting or being the attorney for the company, if they're operating out of a state maybe that you're not necessarily affiliated with or licensed in, do you have to bring in someone from that state, or are you able to kind of look at that state's what may be specific to that other state and kind of help guide them through that process?
I'm based in Florida. I'm a Florida attorney. I'm also licensed in DC. I do stuff in DC. Outside of those two jurisdictions, if my client is doing business nationwide or doing specific business in a particular jurisdiction that I'm not licensed in or I'm not familiar with, I will bring in a business law attorney like from New York or from California or whatever to help out as far as the specifics of them actually doing business in there. Not just selling things, but actually having a physical or big presence in those states. One of the things that I would say, obviously a very simple item that applies to everyone is sales tax. So if you're selling something or selling services or providing services from one state to another, you have to be very familiar with what your sales tax are, where you're selling your goods at, because you're going to have to pay sales tax, and the state's going to come looking for their money at the end of the year. So that's one thing where if you're a online retailer or you're shipping things across state lines, that's probably the most simple item that you're going to get clipped on is state sales tax, just as a brief, quick issue.
A question I see come up a lot with business owners, obviously in specific spaces, is about their intellectual property and how they should or can go about protecting it. Some will say, well, it's not even worth it because it's too expensive to kind of protect it, but also too expensive to influence or utilize any patents or IP that they have. When should someone think about, yes, this is something that's worth protecting?
IP will focus on the P part, property. It's property of your business. So just like if you rented a space, you would have liability insurance or renter's insurance. You would, to protect your real property or your personal property, you want to protect your intellectual property as soon as possible, particularly if you're in a business where you're, franchising, or you're coming up with some kind of new technology, or you're doing something creative where you're putting out material. You want to make sure you protect that as soon as possible, because you may lose the right to protect it if you put it out there in the general public without trying to protect it to begin with, because someone else can appropriate your IP, and because you didn't protect it, they can just claim it's theirs, and they can actually go register a trademark or register or attempt to register a copyright or a patent because you didn't do it. So very important, something that if you're having intellectual property as part of your startup business or just as part of your business, you want to make sure that that's at the genesis of the business of protecting it. And that's got to go into your budget and your business plan of if you're going to generate IP, you want to protect the IP. And, otherwise it's just like leaving your door wide open, leaving for the day going home. I mean, someone can walk in there and take all your stuff. Same thing for your IP. If you don't protect it, someone can walk in or virtually walk in and take whatever they want. So it's very important to do at the beginning because it's very hard to retroactively try to protect your IP after it's already out in the public.
You mentioned about cannabis and how they come under a lot of regulations. Are there any other sectors out there that have distinct legal challenges or things that business owners should be aware of before they get started in a specific sector?
Well, cannabis is probably the best example because it's all over the map. It's totally state by state specific. And then again, it's still banned by the federal government. So
yeah, you're not going to get more unique than that.
Yeah, it's very unique. I mean, that's probably the most unique example of you need to know specifically what's going on in your jurisdiction. Otherwise, you're going to get in major trouble. Another thing that's getting there is Bitcoin and blockchain and things like that, where states are coming on now. Some states are at the forefront of trying to regulate that industry, if you want to call it an industry, even though it's multiple industries in one, where states are coming online trying to regulate that because that's, that's the Wild West out there as far as what's going on, what you can do, what you can't do, what's permissible. States are trying to get on board to regulate that. The federal government's trying to get on board to regulate that because technically, certain things could be considered commodities or certain things could be considered essentially stock or cash, where the federal government's going to want to have a say in how that's transferred because they're going to want to tax it. So that's an area where there's emerging law, not just in the federal level, but the state level. Web3 is another area where that kind of goes with the blockchain thing, where things are going to get regulated on a state-by-state basis, and you got to be on the cutting edge of that, if not also on a federal level. Basically just anything with technology is going to be out there, and you got to keep up with what's going on.
I'm sure contracts are a big part of what you get involved with, and obviously the legal aspect of what an entrepreneur gets involved with. How do you help them negotiate favorable terms, but also so that they can maintain good relationships with whether it's a client, a partner, a supplier, a vendor, someone that they're working and want to have a long-term relationship with?
Yeah, well, one of the first things, obviously, it goes without saying, you need to have contracts in all your relationships in business because contracts are the roadmap on how you conduct yourself, on who does what, when, where, how people are paid, what people's obligations are, what people's responsibilities are. If there's a breach of those responsibilities or obligations, the solution to fix it is in your contract, or at least it should be. Your venue is in your contract. Your attorney's fee clause is in your contract. So one of the things I always tell my clients is you always have to have a contract. So even if you're, instead of an invoice, send something that you make the other party sign that is a binding contract. And if you get involved in business with anyone, you bring on a partner, you buy, you sell something, always have a contract. So the main point is always have a contract. Once you have a contract, or once you're trying to get a contract, to answer your specific question of how you negotiate it, I mean, I have clients bring me contracts all the time that we go back and forth and negotiate. And then I also have contracts that I draft for them where they bring to someone else to negotiate. So, I mean, it's a back and forth process on the negotiation. I mean, it's just like any other thing in business. It's negotiable. So you want to put the best terms forward for your client. Sometimes the other side's not going to agree to those terms. And then it comes down to your client ultimately having to make a business decision because you've taken them as far as you can from a law standpoint. and they have to make a business decision of whether they're going to enter into that contract or not, if it's not perfect, if it doesn't have all the terms they want. But as an attorney, I try to make the contract as reasonable and fair as possible, obviously to my client's benefit. But some things, sometimes contracts are take it or leave it when you deal with huge companies or the government. And that's another thing where there's no negotiation on those contracts. So that's another thing where it's the client's ultimate decision on whether they enter into it or not enter into it.
Yeah, I'm sure even with good contracts in place, there's going to be disputes that come up. How do you help guide an entrepreneur whether they should litigate or whether there's some kind of alternative, dispute resolution like arbitration or mediation? What are their options, and how do you kind of go through this is the best approach that they should take?
Sure. So if you have, we'll just say hypothetically, you have a contract that's breached. Depending on what's in the contract, there could be a dispute provision in there on what you're supposed to do. But essentially, it comes down to there's 3 different avenues that you can go for dispute resolution. There's mediation, which is voluntary, where both sides meet up with a mediator. It's totally confidential. It's totally not binding. The goal is the mediator tries to get you both to agree on an outcome, and either you agree on an outcome and settle the case, or you don't. And that's mediation. There's nothing binding there. No one's twisting any arms. It's totally voluntary. There's arbitration, which is another form of alternative dispute resolution, where the parties agree that essentially they're going to go to private court instead of go to regular court. Arbitration, for lack of a term, it's like a private court. So you're either going to have one arbitrator or a panel of 3 arbitrators decide the dispute between you and the other party. So you're going to file a complaint or a claim. They're going to file defenses. You're going to go through the arbitration process where you have discovery, where you get to ask questions, you get to get documents, you get to set up your case, and then ultimately you have a final arbitration hearing where you present your case, kind of like in court. They present their case, kind of like in court, and then the arbitrators or arbitrator writes a decision that is based on their observations, their conclusions of law, and their conclusions of fact. And ultimately, that is binding. So the benefits to arbitration are that it's generally speaking faster than going to court. It's private, so everything's not on some public docket somewhere. And you get a little more control over than if you go to court. The problem with arbitration is that it can be very expensive because, and we'll get to litigation in a second, but arbitration, since it's kind of a private court, you have to pay the arbitration fee. You have to pay for the arbitrators to do their jobs. And then you have to pay your own attorney's fees. And then depending on if your contract has an attorney fee provision in it, you may pay the other side's attorney's fees as well. So it could get very pricey depending on the circumstances. But some people choose arbitration. They like arbitration. Arbitration is a huge business. There's 3 main arbitration companies out there nationally in the U.S. that handle the majority of arbitrations, and they all do a pretty good job. The third alternative is litigation. So litigation is like you see on TV. You file a lawsuit. The other side responds eventually. You have discovery, just like we talked about, where you ask questions, exchange documents, do things. You go through motion practice. You try to narrow down the issues. And then eventually, if you can't settle the case in mediation, because most courts require you to go to mediation when you file a lawsuit, then eventually you have a trial. And it's either a bench trial in front of a judge or a jury trial in front of a jury, where literally anything can happen. So the downside of litigation is that it can take a long time. It can be very costly because you're paying for your attorneys. If you lose and there's an attorney fee provision, you're going to be paying for the other side's attorneys. But the benefit is, unlike arbitration, other than paying your initial filing fee, you're not paying the judge. So arbitration, you have to pay for the use of the arbitrators and the arbitration form and things like that. In court, it's other than your initial filing fee, it's free. So the issue is that court used to take generally speaking, could take a long time to resolve disputes. Where I am in Florida, since COVID happened, the Florida Supreme Court kind of went back and looked at how cases were filed and cases are done in Florida at the state level. And they basically came up with a bunch of new rules to streamline cases and to push cases along much faster, where they now want even complex cases done within 18 months of filing, and for less complex cases done within a year. And that's at the state level, and that's happening throughout the country. Several states are implementing that to try to streamline and speed up litigation. At the federal level, in federal court, it's always been streamlined and very deadline oriented, and very, once things are set, they're set in stone and they go forward. So federal cases generally take much shorter than state cases, even expedited state cases. Now, the issue is in making, and ultimately your client making a business decision of which form of dispute resolution to choose. It comes down to what you're looking for, what you're looking to do, what your budget is, what the other people's attitude is, or what the other people's resources are, their ultimate collectability. It all goes into a giant, matrix that ultimately you make a decision on whether you want to go to court, whether you want to arbitrate if there's an arbitration provision, whether you want to mediate if there's a mediation provision, and ultimately whether you even want to spend the money to do that. Because again, just because you get a judgment doesn't mean that, a guy shows up and hands you a check or someone wires you money into your account. All's a judgment or an arbitration award is a piece of paper that allows you the right to then try to go and collect that money. Nobody's guaranteed to pay you. So that's another thing that goes into your, your matrix of making a decision, is that, are you going to collect on this? Is it collectible? Is this worth putting in the amount of money it's going to take to try to collect the amount of money that's in arrears? So that's part of the big business decision matrix too.
Yeah, so definitely a lot involved. What do you see some of the trends, or what do you see changing in the legal landscape, and specifically for entrepreneurs over the next couple of years?
The thing that I discussed about Web3 is probably a big thing that's going to happen, and that's for people who don't know Web3, it's dealing with decentralization of the internet and dealing with separate networks and things like that. That's a big, huge thing that's going to affect everyone, because there's a lot of people who are trying to decentralize and put up their own proprietary systems and things like that. And that goes hand in hand with the blockchain and cryptocurrency movement. So you're going to see a lot of that as a business owner, whether you want to see it or not. I mean, there's going to be more and more people who try to pay with cryptocurrency or do things with cryptocurrency. And a lot of people will try to do more things with like electronic contracts versus real life contracts, or even contracts that are PDFs that you sign. It's going to be totally electric and blockchain driven. Other issues are going to be, changes in the law regarding controversial issues like cannabis, like again, blockchain, other issues dealing with pay equality, gender equality, things like, human rights kind of issues that apply to business, apply to employees, and just a lot more stuff based on AI coming into play with businesses. And again, you gotta, that's one thing it's out there and it's not going to go away. So you kind of got to figure out how you're going to integrate it into your business and the legalities that go with that. You're also going to have, since COVID, changes in commercial real estate and having real brick and mortar spaces versus virtual spaces. A lot of people figured out, I guess, during COVID that they're wasting a lot of time going to the office where they can just work from home. So there's going to be a lot of work from home issues regarding employees' liability and things of that nature. So yeah, those are a few things that are going to be on the horizon for the next few years.
Yeah, the AI thing should be interesting, because I'm hearing everything from it's like going to have minimal impact to it's like everything. We're all going to be talking to robots all the time. So That should be all right. Well, I appreciate it. That's all the questions I have for you today, Matthew. I want to thank you for being on today's episode. You really gave some great info. Really appreciate you talking about how complex the legal aspects and how important it is to really make sure you take care of them right from the start. Before we go, how best can someone reach out to you, find out more about what you do?
The best way to reach me is to go to my website, which is fornarolegal.com. So it's just my last name, Fornaro, Fornaro, legal.com. It'll have all my contact information on it. It'll have all my social media on it. It'll have all my podcasts on it. It'll have all my how-to videos. It'll have my white pages or white papers. And it'll have my blog post that at this point, if you have a question, I probably have the answer on my website for it. So it's a good place to go.
Great. We'll link to all that on the in the resources section of the show notes. Thanks again, Matthew, and thank you to everyone who tuned in today. Don't forget to follow the Agent of Wealth on the platform you listen from and leave us a review of the show. We're currently accepting new clients, and if you'd like to schedule a one-on-one consultation with our advisors, please do so at bautisfinancial.com/call.
Thank you for listening to the Agent of Wealth podcast. Click the subscribe button below to be notified when new episodes become available. The information covered represents the views and opinions of the guests and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of Bautis Financial. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only and is not intended to be a substitute for professional financial planning and investment advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding your investments and financial planning.